It's my privilege to be here. Thanks to the RBA team for putting all of this together and inviting me to the conference. But it's also a privilege to be here because I'm only here because of my economics teacher, who actually is here in this room, Mr. Florido. Whatever I get wrong, you know who to blame. But just a little bit of background to myself. So I'm an economist at the Productivity Commission. I'm based in Melbourne these days, but I'm actually from Brisbane originally. So I found economics through Mr. Florido in my high school. My parents did things that were very different to economics. It's not something that ever really crossed my mind before being in his class, and I'm grateful every day. From there, I went to University of Queensland, and I started off in finance and economics, but found my way into politics, philosophy, and economics, which has a bit more of a policy bent, and that was really my thing. So I chose to finish that degree, and then I went on to do 4 years in a consultancy called Deloitte Access Economics, where I did a lot of work in sort of social policy, education, and everything in between. And more recently, I'm now in the productivity team at the Productivity Commission. My job today is to give you the lowdown on what it is that we do and get you excited about all things productivity. So what is the Productivity Commission? We're the Australian government's independent research and advisory body on all things economic, social, and environmental. Our mandate is first and foremost to improve productivity in Australia, but we also think about how we can reduce unnecessary regulation, enhance international competitiveness, facilitate adjustments in the economy as sort of technological change occurs and other productivity-induced changes occur. And we do all of these things not just with an economic lens, but also with consideration to community, ecological factors and international factors as well. In terms of what we do, there are really 5 things, mainly the first 3. So we run inquiries. So the treasurer will give us a mandate or an area of policy or a policy problem to think about, and we'll take that away for about a year and come back with a series of recommendations that they then hopefully take seriously and implement. But we also do research that's self-driven by the Productivity Commission. There's a process that we go through to determine what research topics might be of most value and interest to the Australian public. And those can usually go. They're often a little bit shorter than an inquiry. They might be 6 to 12 months. And then we also have some regular monitoring and benchmarking activities. So that's things like the report on government services, the trade and industry review. We also monitor the Closing the Gap policy agenda and outcomes. And then we also have these other 2 functions, which is competitive neutrality complaints and safeguard action investigations. I wanted to start off by, rather than talking about how we measure productivity or how we think about productivity, giving you a rundown and an argument on why it is that we should actually care about this in the first place. At its core, I think we have to start with GDP, right? We're all aware of what gross domestic product is. It's key economic inputs like land, labor, capital, these things, very 101. But what productivity can be understood to be is how well we're using all of those resources together. So, another way of putting it is that productivity is a secret sauce of the economy. And you can really see that that's the case when you look at this chart here, where we're plotting productivity against 2 other sort of key measures of broad macroeconomic measures of well-being in Australia, real wages and GDP per capita. We see that they generally track reasonably well. That kind of makes the case for productivity, that this is, it's all well and good to have all the land and labor and whatever capital, but ultimately it's how well we're using these things that determines our livelihoods. Putting this in more tangible terms, you can see how we reap the gains of productivity when you look at essentially our consumption bundles now or in 2019 versus back at Federation. A kilogram of rump steak used to take the average Australian worker about 2.5 hours to earn. Now it's 40 minutes, right? a loaf of bread used to take 20 minutes worth of labor, whereas now it's about 5.5 minutes. This is a long-run phenomenon, and I think that's one of the reasons it's hard to really conceptualize and appreciate the importance of productivity. You don't necessarily see it day to day, but you do see it decade to decade, and that's what this slide here sort of hopes to communicate, or aims to communicate. So yes, productivity is about more stuff and better stuff as well, but it's also about having more time, more leisure. What you see in this chart here is how the average number of hours has changed for the average Australian since 1980. And the key takeaway here is that as of 2024, the number of hours that the average Australian worker is working has declined by about 10%, right? Where we've chosen to reap some of the benefits of our productivity by reducing the amount that we have to work. So it's not just more stuff, better stuff, it's also more free time, more leisure. The great thing about productivity is we actually get to choose how we want to consume it, right? And maybe it's a strange way of putting it, but that is essentially what we're doing. We're choosing to consume productivity either through more better things or more free time. This is just a simple analysis that the Productivity Commission did quite recently. We put out quarterly productivity bulletins. Keep an eye out if you're interested. But what we did is we took the GDP per capita and the number of hours that the average Australian was working back in 1980, and we held one or the other constant. And we worked out what would have happened if we'd said, okay, let's consume all of our productivity benefits as time off, time not having to work. And what this suggests is that, well, if we'd chosen to reap productivity, the benefits of productivity in that way, we'd be working almost half as much today on average as we were in 1980. We did the same thing by holding hours worked constant. That's what the right-hand side chart there is doing. And the difference there is slightly less, but nonetheless, this suggests that we consume about 20 percentage points less in GDP per capita terms. So, the overwhelming preferences of Australians that this suggests is that we like more better stuff, but we do like a little bit more free time as well. And that's okay, right? That's okay that that's what our preference is. One of the benefits of that being our preference is seen in intergenerational mobility. So what this chart's doing is it's showing how many or what percentage of children in Gen X earned more than their parents did based on the income decile of their parents. So, for example, if a child's parent was in the bottom 10% of income earners in Australia in 1976 to 82, more than 90% of their children, or of children in that bracket, ended up earning more than they did in their life, or through their lifetime. And if we sort of aggregate these figures, we see that that's true for 2/3 of this whole generation of people. So that's one example of how productivity can, or the distributive impacts of productivity. It's not just concentrated in a select group of people. It's at least the way that the Australian policy landscape has been set up over the last few years. It is ultimately disseminated across the population. Another way that we can think about how the gains of productivity are distributed is by looking at our social safety net. So, Damien pointed out the share of the budget which goes towards welfare expenditure. This is, it's probably a subset of that expenditure, but it's a similar story. What this suggests is that the per person expenditure by the Australian government on welfare expenditure has increased by about 50% from 2002 to 2022. This is only one part of the social safety net. You've also got health expenditure, education, and so on. But this sort of makes the case, or makes the point of another way that productivity is able to be distributed across the population. And to be clear, the reason for this is that when Australia gets more productive, the government is able to collect more revenue and then choose to distribute it. And this is how we've chosen to distribute that revenue. So I hope I've made my case. Now we'll get on to sort of some of the details on how we actually think about measuring productivity. So we can think about this you can think about it through lots of lenses. I'm going to think about it through two lenses, a broad macroeconomic and microeconomic view. So what we've got here is just a macroeconomic view. In its core, what we can think about, or the way that we can think about productivity at the macroeconomic level, is the total amount of gross domestic product created in Australia divided by all economic inputs. And so, essentially, that comes down to labor and capital. Putting this into context of some of those slides that I had up earlier around choices of leisure versus consumption, if we were to hold labor hours constant, but we saw GDP increase, and let's say also capital was constant, then that would be a representation of an increase in productivity. And that increase in productivity would be fully allocated towards more stuff. Similarly, if gross domestic product was unchanged, capital was unchanged, but labor hours and wages declined, all else equal around population and all of that sort of thing, that would be an indication of productivity gains being entirely reaped by more leisure or less work. So that's a simple way of thinking about productivity at the macroeconomic level. At the microeconomic level, we've got this fun little example of chocolate bars. If you imagine a chocolate factory with a worker who creates chocolate bars and is able to create 2,000 chocolate bars in a 40-hour work week, their productivity can be viewed in sort of two ways. The first is, well, they can produce about 50 chocolate bars per hour. That's their productivity. If we're thinking about it in something closer to a gross value, GDP, akin term, we might include what the price of that chocolate bar is. So if the price is $2 and the worker makes 50 chocolate bars per hour, then their productivity is 100. In essence, it's this example being scaled up that gets you to that macroeconomic view. Of course, these are both stylized, but I hope that they more or less get the point across. But where does productivity actually come from? That's a tougher question. When we think about productivity, we're often thinking about labor productivity. That's probably the most common measure that gets cited, for example, in the media. And what that is it's total gross domestic product divided by hours of work, and total hours of work across all people in the economy. Again, there's always extra steps depending on who's doing the analysis, but that's the crux of it. Labor productivity can be broken down into two components, though. We call these capital deepening and multi-factor productivity. Capital deepening it's a measure of the amount of capital that a person has access to, or that a unit of labor has access to per unit. A way of imagining an increase in capital deepening, or an increase in productivity through capital deepening, is, for example, consider a farmer who, pre-industrialization, is just planting by hand, versus a farmer today who has a harvester, tractors, so on and so forth. That farmer is able to do so much more now than they were before this new technology, and that's enabled by this additional capital. So that's a way of kind of understanding capital deepening. Multi-factor productivity is then sort of a measure of how well we are able to use our economic inputs together. So that's maybe more airy things like, are we good at rostering our labor and effectively allocating it through that means? Are there good mentorship systems in place in a workplace to help the younger, more junior members sort of upskill? How well are people upskilling through the education system? these are all ways of kind of understanding multi-factor productivity. And what drives productivity? All sorts of things. Here are 6 big ones. Technological improvement. So, look back at my agrarian example of farmers moving on to tractors and harvesters, or an office worker moving on from pad and pen to, computer and Excel. Those are all examples of technological improvement. Maybe more recently is large language models, AI, these sorts of things. Economies of scale and scope. So as a business or an industry becomes bigger, more mature, it's often able to produce more with fewer additional resources per unit of output. So that is another driver of productivity. Workforce skills, how educated is your workforce? How much upskilling is able to happen once in the workforce as well? Management practices, so mentorship, scheduling, these sorts of things. Competition is another big one. As companies compete for market share and consumers, they're forced to cut prices, find new ways of doing business. That's another word for productivity. And then lastly, macroeconomic business cycles, short-term fluctuations in output and demand for labor, and all of these sorts of things also impact productivity, though that's more of a short-term phenomenon. Challenges in measuring productivity. So we can only understand something as well as we can measure it. I think it's easiest to start to get at this when we think about gross domestic product, which is a key input into our at least macroeconomic understanding of productivity. The Australian economy is about $2.3 trillion large as of 2024. And we've got quite a diverse array of sectors. We've lumped services all together, but there's a whole bunch of different offerings there as well. This $2.3 trillion does not include the black economy. It doesn't include natural accounting, things like the degradation of the environment and the impact that has. That's only captured insofar as it's actually reflected in market prices. Social connections that drive people's ability to do business together and create new ideas. Unpaid work and products with zero price. These are things that either aren't included or we're just not very good at measuring. And if we're not very good at measuring them in GDP or in hours worked or in our capital stock, then that's going to impact our ability to measure productivity. I'm not going to deep dive into each of these factors, but I did want to touch on what this sort of a case study of this through the lens of the non-market sector. So the market sector is something that we're typically quite good at measuring the productivity of because we're good at measuring quantities and prices, and that's all reasonably straightforward. Non-market sectors, so this is things like education, health, anything where the government will often have some impact, which can be considered non-market. These we're not quite so good at measuring the output for, and that is reflected in our productivity figures. So what you see here is that, well, our whole of economy GDP has, been going. It's had a bit of a bubble, which I'll get back to shortly. But, it's generally gone on a trend. But the market sector is systematically more productive on average compared to the non-market sector, which the way that we measure it is a drag on productivity. The question is whether this is a representation of the non-market sector actually being unproductive or our ability to measure its productivity. We have two worlds, or let's say two teachers or two schools. In one school, there are 20 students per teacher. Wouldn't we love 20 teachers per student? 20 students per teacher. In another school, there are 40 students per teacher. Now, on the surface, this second school looks a lot more productive. Right? Their output is, at least by standard measures, twice as large as the first school or the first teacher. But there are all sorts of things it's not accounting for. It's not accounting for the quality, right? is a teacher able to as effectively teach a cohort or a school class of 40 students as the teacher with 20 students? It doesn't take into account things like the impacts that this might be having on attendance rates. It also doesn't take into account your sanity. So, this is just one example of the challenges in measuring productivity in the non-market sector. There's a million others in education and health, in everything. Recent trends. We're getting towards the end. I wanted to wrap up with sort of a state of productivity as it stands in Australia. So, the Productivity Commission recently put out a research piece on what we're calling the productivity bubble. This occurred through COVID. So, and we've kind of identified three stages of this bubble. The first was a reallocation phase. So this started when the lockdown sort of first kicked in. And what the lockdowns did was mostly affect what are measured to be less productive industries, industries which have a lower skilled labor base, things like retail and hospitality. These, the social industries that we all had to forego for various periods of time, depending on which state you were in. That actually led to an increase in productivity because the labor force size reduced and it lost some of the lower skilled workers, which conversely then means that the workforce is actually of higher productivity. Is that a useful measure? Well, I'll leave that to you to think about. Then when lockdown sort of slowed down or started happening more sporadically, we saw a productivity gain phase. That was a reflection of GDP increasing quite substantially, pent-up demand, all of these sorts of things, and employment increasing over that period, but at a slower rate than GDP was increasing. So look back at the numerator and denominator that I put up earlier. If labor hours are increasing at a slower rate than GDP, you're getting more productive. But then we saw a decline in the bubble. Essentially, the bubble popped. And that we've identified as a reflection of the capital stock not being able to keep up with the increase in employment. So as employment continued to increase, we went back to essentially pre-COVID levels. So that's the very recent history of productivity in Australia. Let's look back 60 years or so, and we see another sad story, where over the last sort of 60 years, average productivity growth year on year has been about 1.6%. The last 10 years has been a fairly dismal 0.4%. Some of this, I'm sure, will be a result of some of these measurement problems that we've kind of been speaking through, but it's not all that. That's not going to be the full explanation. So this is something that the Productivity Commission is thinking a lot about right now, and the government of the day, which I'll get to shortly. Fortunately or unfortunately for us, this is an international story. In fact, by this chart, we seem to be doing a little bit better than much of the OECD. But nonetheless, across the OECD, or the key countries which are included in this chart, this last sort of 15 years has been a notably lower productivity growth period than the 15 years prior. So we're all in this together, figuring it out. But we are worried because, looking back at the beginning of my presentation, productivity is the key driver of prosperity in Australia. So we're worried about it. What do we think has driven this decline? We think there are 5 factors. There will be others, but these are the big ones. Firstly, we've shifted towards less capital-intensive industries. So you saw when I pulled up GDP that services now make up more than half of the Australian economy. Services are typically less capital-intensive. Less capital-intensive means lower capital deepening. That's going to drive lower productivity. Reduced boost from technological change in recent years. Maybe that's at a tipping point. but we're yet to see any impact from recent AI, LLM technologies feed through in a significant way. Low investment. This has been a chronic issue in Australia since both the end of the GFC and or the end of the mining boom, depending on what you're kind of counting, where as a share of GDP investment has sort of systematically declined from around about 20% to more like 16, 15%. Don't quote those numbers, but that's roughly the magnitude. So that's another driver. Reduction in economic dynamism, so people are changing jobs less now than they used to, and businesses are entering on a per capita basis new markets to a lesser extent than they previously have. So that's kind of a competition story. And then lastly, like with AI, this might be turning around. There's been a lack of policy reform and emphasis on productivity, but this is getting talked about more and more. There's the Productivity Summit coming up. And there's the 5-pillar inquiry from the Productivity Commission. The Treasurer, about 6 months ago, gave us a mandate to look into this 5-pillar inquiry, where we're thinking about, 5 different areas of reform for the Treasurer and government of the day to consider in improving productivity in Australia. So we're thinking about these 5 pillars. The first is creating a dynamic and resilient economy. The second is building a skilled and adaptable workforce, harnessing data and digital technologies, delivering quality care more efficiently, and investing in cheaper, cleaner energy and the net zero transformation. Within these, we have, I think this is the final list. It might not be. You'll be able to find out in like 2 weeks' time. We've got roughly 15 reforms across each of these pillars. And this is what a large portion of the team has been working on. I myself have been working on the corporate tax reform. Don't ask me questions. I'm not allowed to tell you. But I promise that it is more interesting than it sounds. So that's where I will leave you for Q&A. But I hope that you're as excited about productivity as I am.